Greetings. Welcome to Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality. This is Dr. Connie Zweig, and I'll be interviewing my husband who lives in spiritual awakening. You may have heard about this or read about it, but you may not know someone who lives it day to day. We'll be exploring how non-duality developed in Dr. Neil as I've observed it over 25 years, and as he directly experiences it every day. Each podcast will explore a different theme. We look forward to you joining us. Greetings. Welcome back to Dr. Neil's podcast with Dr. Connie. And today we're going to talk about doing psychotherapy as a spiritual path. And I think some of you will be surprised when you recognize that the internal experience of being a psychotherapist, or it could be a psychologist or a family therapist or a social worker, also has many levels of consciousness. And in each of those levels or states, there's a different experience of doing psychotherapy. So, Dr. Neil, do you want to kind of start with the overall benefits of being a psychologist? Because I know you have loved this work for many decades.
Yes, I've been doing it for 44 years and loved it. It's been, for me, part of the spiritual path and very important in terms of social and moral and emotional development, which I think is missed out by a lot of spiritual paths. And that's why we get people acting out. My training as a psychologist and my practice built a sense of other-centeredness, putting aside my own ego and listening to the client intensely, being with the client, having compassion for the client and caring for the client and empathy for what is going on inside of the client, and performing the role of a psychologist and a psychotherapist.
So we might call this stage one because it's dualistic.
Yes.
It's a subject-object role.
Yes, the therapist, or myself as a therapist, had an office, so I supplied the space, which was private and ethical in the sense that what was spoken about was not to exit the room. I had to do a good job. I was trained. There was a promise involved that this would improve the psychological well-being of the client. And I would set a fee that was reasonable, and I would take care of the client's emotional needs.
And I think part of your role was to assess and diagnose and make a treatment plan.
Yeah, so assessment involved understanding the psychiatric and psychological diagnoses, and that was important to do, to have a treatment plan, which I would be able to do for the client, to have a pattern which was important to follow.
And so this creates a subject-object relationship, right? Subject, therapist, object, client.
Right.
In which there is a superior-inferior dynamic.
Correct. The client comes to me because I have knowledge and training and capacity, and I'm recognized by the institution in the culture as being able to heal and help. And they need to submit to that framework. Otherwise, there's no therapy that could happen. And while I'm doing that, the client also has responsibilities. This is not spoken about too much in the literature. But the client needs to come to therapy on time, work on themselves, not on me. And the client would sit in a chair comfortably and look into their own conscious and unconscious material. And so I would also attempt to do that with the client. So this creates a dualistic framework where the therapist has a specific role and the client has a specific role. And together they set goals, conduct this thing called therapy, which is really happening in a bigger context of what I call love.
Okay, so let's go to stage 2 then. What was your experience?
Well, what happened to me as I was doing this, I started to discover that clients were bringing in material in a session, which I needed in order to grow emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And so I began to realize that therapy, while I needed to maintain the framework of being the psychologist treating the client, was also bigger than that. It was a system in which the client was actually treating the psychologist and was helping me to grow. I couldn't put that as an open process with a client, but was happening subjectively for me in the process.
So what came to you in this system, this larger system, that cultivated your development, that was no longer a one-way street, but became reciprocal?
Well, I would be working on myself on, say, a problem of narcissism, of self-centeredness, and the client would bring in the room a problem to dealing with narcissism. And so I became aware that there was something happening here that was not just that dualistic framework of subject, object, of therapist, client. This actually seemed to happen in cycles. So I would have a day of 8 patients, clients, and they would all bring in dealing with narcissism. And I would be dealing with narcissism. So this was very good for my own growth. And maintaining the framework of me being the therapist was transcended and included being the therapist as well as the client being my therapist.
So this brings to my mind the term intersubjectivity, where there's some field that gets created between the two unconscious psyches that's larger than each individual psyche. It reminds me of Robert Bly's notion of the third body in a relationship.
Right. The system that is created when a client and a therapist are in the same room together can be explained much better by family systems than by individual psychotherapy. And there's a flow of unconscious material which is happening as well as conscious material which is happening. And we're coming together in the room to solve problems of the world in terms of people's lives.
So do you have any examples so that in the third body, because we have talked about that in the context of our relationship too.
Right.
That we call it the we-ness. So there's this we-ness or this field. There's a whole field now of intersubjective psychotherapy, which is about this invisible interaction between the body, mind, psyches of the two people in the room. And some of it is about the family systems that are in the room, right? Everybody's ancestors are there in the therapy in their own kind of ghost-like presence, right?
Right.
But there's also this kind of field phenomenon that gets created that's larger than all of that.
Well, you said it. You said it very well. I don't really have much to add to it, except the fact that intersubjectivity and family systems is now part of counselors and psychologists' practice. There are those who focus on that. The advantage is they include the dynamic between the client and the therapist. And the disadvantage is that most of them ignore the first stage and consider this the first stage, which is the importance of diagnosis, treatment planning, and holding the framework of a therapist client.
And also orienting to the individual personal unconscious of
Correct.
the client.
So they tend to ignore that,
right,
which is the risk of developing this capacity to focus on the intersubjective field, the system that is going on.
So what about stage 3? It seems to me that this field between the two is connected to something larger still.
Yes. So I began to realize when people were, for example, bringing in narcissism, and I was working on narcissism, that this was not just myself and the client, but was dealing with the client's family. I was dealing with the client's community. I was dealing with my own family, own community. I was dealing with the world and the problems of the world and the narcissism in the culture, which we can all see today. It's becoming more obvious. So this became aware that there was a narcissism in the universe that we were dealing with, and that this was not just an individual process of the therapist treating the client, or the client and therapist involved in a loving relationship, dealing with narcissism.
And I'm thinking about sort of the classic transference, countertransference, in which the therapist, like you said, you were dealing with your narcissism, it became reflected in the client. So then you're dealing with your countertransference with the client's narcissism. And so that is language that's built into psychodynamic clinical training, but it's still dualistic.
Mm-hmm.
So when we move to stage 3, we start to recognize that the culture is in the room.
That's right. And we are in the culture.
And we are in the culture.
Both are happening at the same time.
And the whole collective unconscious is in the room.
Correct.
We're in it and it's in us.
That's right.
And so in stage 3, is that the beginning of non-dual psychotherapy?
It's the merging of the dual state. It's not quite non-dual, but it's somewhere in the middle.
What do you mean?
That means that this idea of loving oneself and loving the other is in conflict. It's that loving the self has become more primary, in fact, too primary, and so it's hurting the other. It's hurting the culture, the system, the individuals.
So are we talking about only humans? Because when you say the whole universe.
No, this is not just humans. This is others as well.
All species.
All species. In fact, rather than looking at it as we're doing the work as individuals, the cosmos is working through us to manifest this process. So I would find in this stage 3 that verbalization was spontaneous. So the mouth would be speaking. The brain stopped analyzing. The thoughts were part of the structure that was not happening through the individual brain or soul. It was happening spontaneously and always correct, always what was needed. So stage 3 was one in which there was a merging of subject and object. And that sort of entered into the non-dualistic framework that we spent a lot of time already talking about.
So what was that like for you when you started to experience that with your clients?
Well, initially it was confusing.
Yeah.
Because I'm not supposed to be spontaneous. I'm supposed to think as a psychologist before I speak. That's the training. And that applies to counselors or social workers, anybody who does this kind of work. So the training is say little and be mindful about what you say, and use those interventions in order to help the client grow. So that's the training. What I was finding was that I was speaking spontaneously, or rather I was a vehicle for spontaneous speech and spontaneous action and spontaneous thoughts. And that troubled me a little at first because it was in contradiction to my training. So, but with time, what I discovered was that this intuitive, spontaneous, spiritual speech was actually correct and fitted quite congruently into the first stage, the diagnostic assessment and treatment planning and carrying it out. So it was correct. It's functioning.
I remember you had some, before people walked in the room, you would have some knowledge of the diagnosis.
Right. So I started to understand, for example, the narcissistic story, that people were bringing some version of it into the room. And we were working on it. The whole world was working on it. We were the subjects of it. But I started to play with it a little. So before I would go out into the waiting room, I would look at the self, the spiritual self, and ask the question of, what are we going to be dealing with? Of course, that's what we dealt with. So it's the boundaries between self and other were dissolving, and knowledge was actually flowing from the client to myself, from the universe to the self, from the self to the universe. And so these were all merging into sort of a non-dualistic state.
It sounds like you were reading, you were knowing the issues of the client without having to talk to them, or analyze.
Right, because when I was in the room with them, speech was spontaneous, and the source of the problem and the an analysis of the best methods of treatment were all spontaneously part of the conscious process. So it was just another step to go outside the room before I went outside the room, and to know that was what was real and that was what was needed. At the time, I thought it was a psychic gift. Later on, I got to understand it was something called knowing, or the knower. And even later on, more recently, I've become aware of calling it knower without a subject or an object, just a sense of knowing without subject or object.
So, do you believe you would have attained this advanced level of consciousness without practicing psychotherapy?
No, I think certainly the advanced level can be attained without psychotherapy. However, the moral, the empathic, the caring, the training in being ethical is invaluable in spiritual practice. And failure to actually develop those qualities results in abuse, and abuse of the client, or the chela, or the devotee, or the humanity. And that we've spoken about in other forms.
So, let me see if I understand. You're saying that in some ways, doing psychotherapy supplemented some qualities of consciousness that you didn't get from meditation or inquiry practice. Is that what you're saying?
Right. These cannot be skipped. The human journey is one of evolution of the emotional and personal psyche. And to skip it is dangerous for the practitioner as well as for the spiritual devotees.
So, for the many people who are not psychotherapists, do you have any suggestions for how to develop non-judgmental awareness and empathy and open-heartedness and other-centeredness? How to sort of move beyond narcissism in the way that psychotherapy gave us?
Well, I think there are infinite methods of doing this. I'd say the most important thing to remember is that kindness and empathy and caring are intrinsic to being a good human being. And one needs to develop those before one transcends into a spiritual awareness. Why before? Because once one transcends, there's not a sense of morality or empathy or congruence or kindness. There's not a sense of it. There's no ego. And the spiritual realms are available even to cruel people. And many people that I know who attain high levels of spirituality will state very openly that there's no morality once one transcends into the spiritual realms. But that's a mistake.
Because there's no opposites of right and wrong or self and other.
Yes, they don't develop those qualities.
So in a way, your path of being a psychologist for more than 40 years cultivated these parts that were missing in the spiritual domain. And I might suggest that people can also do that as clients in therapy.
Yes, one can be a client and grow in that regard. One can be a potter, making pots and develop this stage of 1, 2, and 3. There's no limits to the variety of mechanisms that one can develop.
So you're saying a craft,
any
a loving relationship,
any profession, any craft,
and a partnership.
Yeah, you don't even have to have a partnership. You can do it yourself. So it can be done individually by having a profession. Somebody once asked me if I ever had a mistress, and my answer was, my work is my mistress. It's the greatest teacher that I've had up until my marriage. So the greatest teaching, greater than the meditative practices.
Yeah, you're such a karma yogi. You're really in service.
Well, that has come through being empathic and a psychologist.
And so maybe we could say service is another path for cultivating these.
There are many forms of service, yes.
But
that would create the heart and not necessarily the sense of the world. One can service animals and plants and nature, and one can actually service all beings in the world, beyond humans and animals and plants, all the subtle energies and beings. So one can be of service to the souls in others. So any form is helpful, but it's going to focus on one aspect, and one needs to eventually focus on all these aspects.
So to close, let's come back to the present moment and just ask you to check in.
And the question is?
What are you experiencing in this moment?
Love and empathy exists eternally, is everywhere, without subject, without object. However, one needs to develop it personally and as part of the ego in order to fulfill the purpose of the universe, which is love.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you found our discussion insightful, there's a good chance your friends will too. And we'd love it if you could take a moment to share this episode with a friend who you believe would appreciate it. Help us spread the word and reach more people. And follow us on any platform. Turn on your episode notifications so you never miss new content. Thanks for being part of our podcasting journey.